Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Agile stage of Positive Technologies Conference. Me and Doc, we are glad to talk about metrics today. Because if the goal of Agile work is its optimization, that should probably take place in relation to something, what we can actually measure or observe to see if we achieve our goals and record the progress. So it's everything about the progress. My name is Tomasz Orzechowski. I'm a Scrum Master, but here today I'm with a real expert in the subject of metrics, author of the great book Escape Velocity, Doc Norton. He's also a head of technology for covered insurance. And if you want to find Doc on web, he can be found as Doc on Dev everywhere. Really cool. It's a pleasure to host you, Doc.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. My wife is 100% Polish. She had suggested that I should open with Dzień dobry.
Dzień dobry. Nice to hear that.
Yeah.
Agile work is based on the certain transparency, trust, and sense of ownership. Should we still trust but verify, as they say?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think the answer to that is yes, but I think that it might look different with Agile Teams than it might in other cases. As a manager, whether it's Agile or not, there's got to be a balance there, right? You can't be overly controlling, or the team and the workers don't really have much autonomy or ownership, but you also can't be laissez-faire. You can't just let the team do whatever. And I think in Agile, sometimes there's this notion of servant leadership, which I agree with, but sometimes the implementation of that is that we just let the team do whatever they think is the right thing to do. And there's got to be a balance there. If we look at, all right, so how is this different, trust but verify, right? If you look at a healthy team, one of the things that they're going to do is they're going to involve their stakeholders in a lot of what's going on. They're going to involve them in the planning. So they're going to bring stakeholders into the discussion of what are the problems that we're trying to solve, what are the outcomes we're trying to achieve, what is it that we're trying to actually accomplish here. And that starts to create a different dynamic. They're also going to be radiating a lot of information outward. These teams should be showing what is the work, what is now, what is near, what is far. They should be showing what are the problems that we're trying to solve. They should be showing what are the outcomes that we're trying to go after, and even what is the flow of our work. And just radiating that information automatically kind of builds not only that trust, but makes verify a lot easier. These teams are probably doing some kind of stakeholder mapping where they know who their stakeholders are and they know what type of information they need at what time, at what interval, and kind of what level of information. So again, verification kind of becomes a little bit easier. It's a little bit more of a passive activity, if you will. These teams are measuring their progress. They're making it visible. And all of this kind of transparency creates that trust. And the verification ends up kind of being a byproduct. So, my expectation would be that if you're working with one of these teams, really at any given time, you know what's going on, and there isn't a need to kind of step in and check and verify. The information's always there, always available. I think it covered, we lead our product and engineering group with a set of behaviors. And the first behavior is know the problem that you're solving. And I've kind of talked about that a little bit. But the second behavior is make the work visible. What's now, what's near, what's far, right? And this goes a long way to creating that transparency and building that trust. And then our third behavior is work together. And that's not just within the team. It's not just the devs, maybe pairing, but it is within the entire organization. So again, bringing in stakeholders, communicating regularly, really collaborating quite a bit. And by engaging with them, involving them in planning, really collaborating, goes a long way, again, towards building that trust, and the but verify requirement gets less and less necessary.
I got it. I think it's very much about the feedback culture, uh, the whole HR setup. What do you think about this? Wouldn't
Yeah.
it be that?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that when you've got the right culture in place, when you've got the right kind of mindset and practices in place, then higher communication, higher trust, verification becomes easier. Yeah.
But then when it comes to management level, like almost every management wants to know if they are on time and on budget. And then from the Scrum team perspective or any team's perspective, how it should be handled. I mean, how should I handle this problem?
Yeah, it's definitely a problem. I think it's independent of Scrum or agility to some extent. If we think about Agile, we think about Scrum, we think about XP, any of those practices, any of those kind of models. What are we trying to do? Part of what we're trying to do is acknowledge that there's a lot that we don't know. Acknowledge that learning is necessary and change is going to happen. And we really want to kind of allow things to emerge. So not as much predetermined sort of, we're going to build this thing exactly like this, and a little bit more, we're going to learn what it is that we should actually be building. So from my perspective, really the first thing that every manager should want to know about is, how are we progressing toward a desired outcome? Right? Are we finding workable solutions, and what have we learned so far? Now, I talked about the behaviors. This goes back to the first behavior: know the problem you're solving, right? And that problem should be based on outcomes. So a lot of times, we get a request: please build this feature, and that doesn't provide the team necessarily clarity about what are we actually trying to accomplish, what are the outcomes that we're after, what's the problem that we're trying to solve, right? And I think it's really important that teams have that understanding. And then, as you're measuring towards those outcomes, it allows you to adapt, to adjust. Oh, we released this small thing, MVP or whatever you want to call it, and it didn't work the way that we wanted it to. So what did we learn from that? How do we change, right? And this actually gets to, again, talking about the behaviors, the sixth behavior, which is validate before, during, and after. I'm looking at for teams to, one, recognize that everything we think we want to build is based on assumptions. So what's the fastest way that we can actually validate some of those assumptions or invalidate them? And maybe we don't have to build a thing at all. I'll give you an example. We had a idea that our business partners would want to be able to get certain information from us. I'm being a little bit vague here, but that's okay. So we want to get certain information from us. And the request came down: please build this capability. And we said, oh, okay. So we assume that our partners will want this information. So we reached out to a handful of our key partners and we talked to them. We said, hey, we're thinking about doing this thing. Would this be of value to you? And a significant majority of them said, no, actually, that's not something that we would be interested in. So we didn't have to build anything, right? So we validated before.
Right.
Then, of course, during, is it behaving the way you want to? Are you learning? And then after, are they actually using it? So back to kind of the original question, right? On time and on budget is not a good way to measure a complex process, a process that involves emergence, a process that involves learning as you go. And that's what product development and the creation of software really is. So instead of on time, on budget, some better questions for managers to really ask. So on time. As we look at this opportunity space, what path do we think gets us to value the soonest? It's still about time, but it's about reducing that learning cycle. It's about getting something out there quickly and, being able to pivot as we learn. So rather than when will this be done, we start to focus on how quickly can we learn, right? On budget. This is an interesting one for me. The way I look at this these days is more along the lines of, based on what we know right now, should we continue to invest in this? So start to think about your projects, if you will, or your product portfolio as investments that you're making. And rather than saying, we are going to build this thing and we're going to spend $2 million on it, what if we spent 50,000? And in that spending, we learned, oh, there's not much traction here. There's not much interest here. Would you continue to invest in something that doesn't have a return? No, you would not. And so you can actually take that money and you can put it someplace else where you're getting a return. So think about it more in terms of, based on what we know right now, should we continue to invest in this? And if it's providing a return, your budget should expand anyway, right? A couple other things that I think that managers, want to be thinking about, focused on. What have we learned in the past week? Maybe it's month, depending on the organization. And how is that influencing our thoughts about how we approach this? So how is this changing in front of us, right? And what assumptions have we left unvalidated? And when do we feel we want to check those? So rather than when is this feature going to be done, start thinking in terms of what are the underlying assumptions and how fast can we actually validate those and then build upon them.
Well, got it. But from the team perspective, if I can make a comment, it requires, and I think this is very important, I'm trying to build it up with my teams, it requires at least a very basic understanding of the whole business, not just the development, not just the feature requirements, but the whole business surrounding.
It does.
Otherwise, we are just not able to think on that level that you mentioned with the management.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. And that's a change for a lot of organizations. A lot of organizations, someone has an idea, they decide that there's a need, something needs to be built. They talk to a product manager, an analyst of some sort. That person then thinks about how this might happen. They might pull in a designer and an architect. They design a whole thing. They break it down. They deliver it to the team, right? And in many cases, that looks, potentially very efficient because each of the steps is isolated and efficient. And the challenge that we have time and time again in organizations is what gets built doesn't match what the expectation was because there's too many disconnections, or what gets built does match the expectations, but it doesn't match the needs of the market. And when we really start to make it clear what are the outcomes that we're after, what are the problems that we're trying to solve, and we actually get the team involved in that. Oftentimes you see things where the team might come up with an alternate approach that we had not originally considered. A simple example, I was working with a large manufacturer and we were rewriting an order entry system for their wholesalers. And we were in pilot mode, so there were only a handful of wholesalers on it. And there was a configuration screen that allowed us to say when wholesalers could be placing orders or not. And there were a couple of other settings on that screen. And one of the members of the business came to the team and said, hey, we need to build out a better authorization system. We need to be able to control who sees what screen and had this whole robust idea of what it is that we need to build out. And we were approaching a deadline where we were going to expand the pilot. And they announced, if we don't have this in place, we cannot expand the pilot. If we missed that deadline, it was going to be another several months before we could expand the pilot. So we simply asked, we said, that sounds great. That sounds very important. We need that. Can I ask if I could wave a magic wand right now and you had that capability, what would it do for us? What specific problem would it solve? And they started with, oh, well, it would control who can see what. Great. What right now do we need to control? They said, well, this configuration screen is out on the web and anyone can get to it, and we don't want that to happen. And the team said, what if we moved that configuration screen inside the network so that only people that work here have access to it? And they said, well, I guess that would work. And that was half a day of work versus several weeks. Understanding the problem we're actually trying to solve, knowing what the outcome is, we came up with a solution that was much faster and allowed us to hit our deadline and allowed us to expand the pilot program.
100% agree. I usually say to the devs, you guys, you need to understand what we are working on, like by understanding what we do here, for whom, and how they would use it, and that this is it, and
Yep.
make most of it in sense of delivering the features. You know what I mean? Yeah. But starting from a very, very basic thing, which is a sprint goal.
Mm-hmm.
Is this the very basic metric that should be used as DNA if we want to work, to act in an iterative way, or not? And then, if yes, how to properly set a sprint goal? Because I think it's a challenge for many teams, and I don't really want to see the sprint goals like complete all tasks. What does it mean?
Exactly. Yeah. So I actually think that this is I think it's a good thing to have. I'm not sure that I would call a iteration goal a metric necessarily, but how often do we achieve that? Might be a good metric. And actually, Thomas, you asked me this question a few weeks ago as we were kind of talking about just the upcoming conference and what might be happening, and I've really been thinking about it because my initial thought was that iteration goals aren't that important, and they're certainly not the DNA of a good team. But like I said, I've actually really been thinking about it, and I actually think that they are very valuable, and realizing that I actually do use them quite a bit. So if you think about what's a good iteration goal, it's about what outcomes we want to accomplish. And like you said, right, I hear a lot of teams that have goals like complete these stories, or worse, complete this number of story points. Right? And they consider that to be their sprint goal, their iteration goal. But really, in a healthier environment where we're acknowledging what's really going on, you should have iteration goals like improve the click-through rate of the customer page, or enable customers to select certain product options. These are actually outcomes. And when you have that as a goal, it gives the team leeway within that iteration to like adjust and adapt. It gives them clarity about what they're actually trying to accomplish. Ideally, it allows them to work together with their stakeholders on how they might achieve the outcome and get closer to it in a single iteration. Now, it turns out this works even if you don't use sprints or iterations. Focus the team on a single outcome they need to achieve, one outcome at a time, work until that outcome is achieved, or you've made significant progress and can defer the rest. Or maybe something else becomes the most important outcome for the team to focus on. But having that clarity of what's the outcome that we are trying to go after and setting that as your goal or your target, that's gonna direct the team well.
I also, you inspired me right now, because with such sprint goals, you really transfer ownership to the people, to the dev team, how they want to accomplish that the best way they can,
Yeah.
actually. And in that sense, they create the real value, and it's up to them to create that value maybe quicker than we actually planned.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
good.
Yeah.
If you had a set, which you certainly did, a basic list of metrics to have such a tool, what would you suggest to start from?
Yeah, that's interesting. So I do kind of have a set that I recommend typically to begin with. It's independent of context, and it might change as I learn more about the team and the environment that they're in. But if I were to come in and just say, hey, here's a handful of things that every team should be looking at because I think they're going to be helpful. I would look at feature use, throughput. I would introduce a cumulative flow diagram. We could talk about that a little bit more in a second. I would be measuring code quality, and I would be measuring some form of team joy or satisfaction. Right. And I think that's basically 5 things. But I think it's a good start. Right. Yeah, it tells us, is what we're creating getting used? Are people adopting it? Are they coming back to it? That's our feature use. And there's some specific measures that you can use in there. Um, you know, how uh, how much are we producing in a time period? So if you're using sprints, how much are we getting done in a sprint? That's throughput. Some people call it velocity. We can talk a little bit about the nuance there. What does your overall flow look like? And that's what a cumulative flow diagram does for us, is we really can look at the flow of work through the various stages and see kind of how the team is performing. Of course, I think we want to know about internal code quality. Is it maintainable? Is it something that we can actually use for the long term? And then team joy, I think, is one that a lot of orgs don't really do a good job of measuring. But I think it's super important to know, is the team engaged? Are they feeling good about what's happening? And this gives us, these 5 things give us a balanced scorecard. So like I said, I think it's a good start. And then you need to kind of look at the organization and what else is going on and figure out what else might help. These days, a lot of times, I will also introduce the DORA metrics. So I don't know if you're familiar with it's DevOps research. And there,
I am, but I'd be happy for you to explain.
yeah. So there, the DORA metrics are deployment frequency. So frequency of successful deployments to production in a time and a given date range. So again, if you're using sprints or iterations, that's a great time range to use for how often did we deploy. This actually, interestingly enough, can correlate to like the size of change. So your batch size affects your deployment frequency. There's other things obviously that do. The next one is mean lead time for changes. So what's the average lead time for changes? And it's the amount of time it takes change to get into production. It is actually from like development done to in production. So this is really telling us about the efficiency of our CI/CD pipelines and deployment. How quickly can we respond? And it correlates to waste in the process and like number of dependencies, et cetera. Mean time to recover. So how long does it take us on average to recover from a production failure? This gives us an indication of how much observability do we have? How efficient is our process, right? Like how quickly can we actually recover? Now that might be that you're using something like a blue-green deploy and recovery is just snap, roll back, right? But there's other techniques that we might be able to use. And then finally, they also include change failure rate. So this is the number of changes resulting in failure for a given time period. And this really kind of correlates to overall code and automated test quality. And they've effectively chosen these 4 because through extensive studies, what they found is that these 4 things all correlate to high performance in a team, in an organization.
Okay, and what about from looking from more like a business side of things? Are we
Yeah.
adding the real value? Are we helping enable outcomes?
Yes.
What
Yes.
would you say on that?
Yeah, so that's great. That's the perfect ad, and that is what starts to come up as we are looking at the context and thinking about what else might we measure, right? So a lot of organizations think about product and engineering, especially just kind of in terms of these technical metrics, but we really need to be thinking about what are the outcomes that we're trying to achieve and what are the right metrics there. So how do you figure that out? So let's say, for example, um, we're creating a solution and we're trying to help people find professional service providers. Let's say we're trying to help them find the right lawyer for their need. Okay, just as an example. So we might want to be measuring things like how many people drop out of the experience, out of our funnel, before they ever even choose an attorney or before they actually attempt to connect with an attorney. How many connections are actually made? How many of those connections result in actual engagement, right? How much time passes between someone saying, hey, I'm interested in talking with this attorney, and the actual engagement happens? And all of those things are really business measures that team might want to look at for, are we being effective? Are we creating a solution that really works for people? Is there an opportunity for us to improve the performance along the way to provide a better service? So those are all kind of business side of things that I think oftentimes teams just, they miss. Um, Even looking at revenue contribution, right? How much
Okay.
money is this solution making for us as a company? Covered one of the things that we look at. So we are embedded insurance, and we are an insurtech organization. We have a agency, a brokerage that we run, and some of the metrics that we look at are how many sales can one agent make in a given day? How long do they spend in communication with our customers? How much data does an agent need to collect while they're having a conversation with the customer? And all of those things help us identify areas where we can say, hey, you know what? If we can find a source to go get that information and bring it back so the agents don't even have to ask it, if we can find alternative ways to engage with customers so that the agents can spend less time on the phone, right? Those are all metrics that we're looking at, and we're trying to, find ways to improve those, because we're then improving the overall customer experience. We're improving the effectiveness of the solution. We're improving the efficiency of the company as a whole.
Okay, good.
Yeah,
Thank you very much. Let's maybe dig a little bit into your practical experience, and if you can share with us um, some of best practices of using of a few metrics, maybe starting from cycle time and lead time.
sure. Yeah. So we talked about so in the cumulative flow diagram, we can see cycle time and we can see lead time. And I think these are both really valuable measures that teams want to be looking at. The way that I look at both of these, lead time and cycle time, it's a way of observing process. How is the team functioning, right? And there's a bunch of different definitions of like what's the lead time and what's the cycle time, and in a lot of cases these days the phrases are like kind of interchangeable, and I'm not sure that it really matters a whole lot. So my perspective, and I'm not saying this is like some exact industry perspective, is lead time is the time it takes to complete an entire series of steps that make up a process. All right, what the heck does that mean? I look at lead time from the moment that we decided we wanted to work on something to the moment that it's actually in production and functioning. right? So that is the entire time it takes from idea, like from hey, wouldn't it be nice if, to hey, ain't that nice. That's lead time. Cycle time is samples of pieces of that process, the time it takes to move through a piece of that process. All right, so let's say, let's keep it kind of basic. You've got the backlog, then you've got your sprint backlog, right? You've got refinement, development, user acceptance, production. That's a pretty basic setup for most organizations. Lead time from backlog to production. Cycle time might be from the start of any step in the process to the end of some following step. So from when it enters development to the end of user acceptance testing, that's our cycle time, right? So how do we use these things? Lead time, you're looking at the overall process. There is a correlation of story size to lead time. So, I might want to look at, if you're doing sizing, estimating, you might want to look at, I've got, let's say we're using Fibonacci, right? I've got 1, 3, 5, and 8. What is the lead time on a 1 compared to the lead time on an 8? Does an 8 take 8 times as long or not? And kind of get an idea of how do those relate to each other, and that might help you see in some organizations an 8 actually takes 12 times as long as a 1, and it might help you rationalize why you should make your stories smaller, right? Looking at lead time variability overall. So I got a bunch of 1s, but they fall within some really wide range of lead times. So I might want to take a look at the outliers and figure out, okay, why did this one take so much longer? But there's some range that's perfectly acceptable. If my difference is between like 3 days and 5 days, that's probably fine. But if there's one that takes 10 days, let's look at that. Let's figure out what happened there. So I can use the variability to know when should I pay attention and when is it just okay. And you can actually use lead time for forecasting as well. I don't tend to do that anymore, but if you wanted to, you could look it up. There's online tools that will help you take your average lead time and then forecast like how long will something take, and be able to actually kind of forecast the backlog, right? All right, so that's kind of lead time. Cycle time. I typically use cycle time to look for bottlenecks in the overall process. Look at the cycle time for each step. Is there one that's significantly greater than the others? Your bottleneck is in there. Is the cycle time highly variable? And a bunch of items move to the next step all at once. You have a batch happening. Why, right? The batch is like a bunch of stuff builds up. Where does this typically happen? Where this might typically happen is user acceptance testing, right? Stuff gets development done and it sits ready for user acceptance testing. And then a whole bunch of stuff gets done and then it all goes through user acceptance testing at once. So you're batching and you've got a challenge there. And why is that? Could you smooth that out? Can you make the flow look a little bit better? So I use cycle time for that kind of thing. And anywhere that you've got a bottleneck, improving the efficiency of the process in front of the bottleneck makes everything worse. All you're doing is overloading that bottleneck, which is going to make it slow down even more. Improve the bottleneck. Use cycle time to figure out where's the area in our flow that we should actually be trying to improve. Don't try to improve everything. It won't actually help.
Okay, when talking about batches, then could maybe monitoring work in progress can help us in reducing batches?
Yeah. So yes, absolutely. Monitoring work in progress can actually help us reduce batches. Obviously, like batches exist everywhere, right? And one of them is, how much stuff are we working on at the exact same time? Now, I'm hearing a lot these days is this mantra about teams should reduce their work in progress to just one item. And so, single piece flow. And I think for a lot of organizations, that's probably super helpful, but I also think this might not be such great advice. If you have 8 developers on a team, does it actually make sense to reduce your work in progress to one item at a time? Probably not, right? So for every system, there's some WIP, some work in progress that's optimal. It's the most that you can get done without jamming up the system. It's the most that you can get done without overly sacrificing quality, right? So rather than strive for one, we probably want to strive for about 80% of what our optimal number is, whatever that number is. And there's some ways that we can at least do a rough calculation for that, and then sort of play with it to figure it out. We can use Little's law for that, and we can probably talk about Little's law in a little bit. I can give a little more detail on that.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I'm not actually familiar with Little's law, what it is,
Okay.
but probably that could be found more in Doc's book. However, what we could comment here is also throughput.
Say it again.
What we should comment here is also throughput.
Oh yes, absolutely. Yeah. So throughput. I think I mentioned this already, right? So throughput and velocity are almost synonymous. Velocity is a what I would refer to as a Scrumism, but it's fairly well synonymous with throughput. Really, the difference: throughput doesn't typically concern itself with work item size, and velocity usually kind of does. But they're really the same measure. So I'm just gonna we'll call it throughput. But if you're thinking in Scrum terms, this is also your velocity, right? So it's the number of work items completed within a given time period. And it doesn't actually matter if the items started in that time period. It's only that they were completed. So, you might have started the work in a prior sprint, and now you've completed it in this one. It counts towards that sprint's throughput. One of the mistakes that I see a lot of folks make is if work gets started in a sprint and doesn't get finished in the sprint, they'll cut it and count half here and half there. And that starts to give you some kind of false perspective on what the team's actually doing and what they're actually able to do. So I wouldn't recommend that. Throughput gives us an idea of what's kind of the capacity of the team in terms of how much work is coming out of the team. Throughput is great for planning and forecasting. It turns out, so I use a technique that is probabilistic forecasting. It specifically is a technique that uses a Monte Carlo simulation. I didn't make it. The folks at Focused Objective made it. This is Troy McGinnis and his team. But they make it available free online. It's basically a spreadsheet that you can download, and you can put in your prior throughput, prior velocity. You can tell it how much work you're trying to forecast, and it will give you a very clear picture of what is the probability of this work completing by a certain date. I found it to be super useful. Same manufacturer. We had a number of instances where someone came to us and said, "Hey, we need this functionality done by, March 10." And we would look at it, we'd run the forecast, and we'd say, "Hey, March 10, we have a 60% probability. If you give us till March 20, we have a 90% probability. We're not saying we can't do 10, but the odds are not very good for us." And it really led to some much better conversations. It turns out that the way that we typically do forecasting is we take the amount of work that we think needs to be done, we take our average velocity, and we divide the work by the average velocity to figure out the number of sprints. How long is the sprint? That's how long it's going to take, right? That's the typical approach. It turns out that is right around a 50% probability. So it's a coin toss. Using this probabilistic forecasting, using the Monte Carlo simulation gives you a much clearer picture. So I highly recommend it.
Yeah, working with metrics seems to be easy compared to more sensitive subject, which is creating the right environment, working with people. So,
Yes.
how to change the perception of metrics in teams? Metrics are such a touchy subjects. I have talked to many teams, and this is really touchy. And how to change it? Do you have any tips here?
Yeah. So I think some of this is just about safety and trust. A lot of teams a lot of people on teams have had experiences where metrics were used in a negative way. They were used really to like hold the team accountable to an expectation that wasn't realistic, or they were used to compare team members against each other. They've had bad experiences, right? So I tend to start with the team itself and conversations about how metrics can serve the team, how it can help them to think about what data would be useful to them, how might they use that, and maybe not even radiate those metrics outwards to begin with. So I might start with a simple, the 5 things that I talked about, right? We might start with a cumulative flow diagram, which allows you to see how work flows through the team. And all I want them to do is, maybe look at it during a retro and talk about what's going on for them. And now they're starting to see how data is helping them, right? We might then take a look at some kind of code quality metrics. And they can have conversations about, is the quality going up or is it going down? And how does that compare to our throughput? As we are moving faster, our quality is going down. What might we want to do about that? And so starting with how does it actually help the team? And then eventually, getting to where kind of like that might be able to radiate out. It's interesting. Change tends to come from action. So when a team starts with cumulative flow diagrams and they start to actually see the flow of their work and they start to talk about that, it starts to change their perspective of who they are as a team. You introduce another metric and it kind of changes the perspective. And eventually they see themselves as teams that are metrics driven. And that becomes important, that they actually have metrics to help them make good decisions. So what is a simple thing that you can put in place that is not weaponized against them so that they can learn and they can change and they can actually adopt that mentality? That's my typical approach. Doesn't always work. Some environments are worse than others. I would look at if you thinking about change and thinking about introducing stuff to people. There's 2 things that come to mind for me. The Chip and Dan Heath, the Heath brothers, they have a book called Switch. It's a really good book. It's a metaphor, but it is about how people think and ways to help them change. It is actually based on behavioral economics. It is the same kind of stuff that you would read in Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. Excuse me. But the Heath brothers make it much easier to read. Thinking Fast and Slow is a very academic book. And then the next one that comes to mind for me is from James Clear, the book Atomic Habits. And James really takes you through how small changes add up in different ways of helping to affect change, small steps at a time.
Okay, got it. You touched the subject of transformation.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds like. Um, so let's maybe try something deep, which is agile maturity. Does the transformation and anyhow or not, and how to measure it?
Yeah. Yeah. Man, this is an interesting topic, right? Um, I would say generally I'm not a fan of trying to measure transformation. And maybe what I really mean is like I see a lot of these different ways of measuring like how agile is a team, how much agile maturity do they have, and I think a lot of them fall short, in part because they're often focused on tools, technologies, practices. They often are stringent. They pre-assume that a certain activity is the right activity or the best activity. So I'm challenged with a lot of these. In fact, the behaviors that I was talking about before um, actually originated in a debate over measuring agile maturity. So I was working at a client through Industrial Logic. Industrial Logic's a great group of folks. I really enjoy working with them. But it happens that they weren't the only consultancy engaged at this client. The client had brought in some other much larger consultancies that were supposed to be helping with the transformation. And one of those brought in this comprehensive assessment for teams as they were trying to transform. And they had this whole idea of like a level 1, level 2, level 3, right? And I think the intentions were good, but I think they were really, really misguided. And a lot of, I personally saw a lot of not very good behavior coming out of that. Um, Tools provided with good intentions meet with a strong organizational ethos. They can often end up causing more damage than fostering good outcomes. And so we were in this conversation about it, and I was just like, look, I don't think this is a good idea. I don't think it's actually serving the teams. I don't think this is how I would want to assess if a team is more or less agile. And so someone was like, all right, all you're doing is saying that's wrong. What would be right? What would you do? What would you look for? And I had not really given this a lot of thought. So it was a fair comment. And I thought for a minute, and I said, you know what? I would be looking for behaviors on the team. I would be looking for indicators of certain things. I don't know. I'd be looking to see, and I started writing on the board, do they work together? Right? Do they think about code composition? Do they release often? I don't remember what the original list actually was, but that list turned into some guidance that we were providing to some teams. And over the years, that has evolved. There are now 8 behaviors on that list, and they are: know the problem you're solving, make your work visible, work together, create simple things in small steps, be meticulous about composition, validate before, during, and after, release ridiculously often, and favor automation over documentation. The way that I use these teams that report to me today, the behaviors are mandatory, but they are non-prescriptive. So what I mean by that is every team has to be able to show how they are engaging in this behavior, and they have to show what behavior are they currently working to improve. But I don't have a thing that says to make your work visible, it has to be in Jira, and you have to use this style of story naming, and you have to use these reports. What you have to do is make sure that you are making that work visible. And what are different ways that you could do that? Explore. And so what happens is, teams try different things. And then we talk cross team to adopt what we refer to as our leading practices. So a team might discover that, hey, one of the ways that we know the problem that we're solving is we use this experiment canvas. And other teams might go, oh, that's interesting. how does that work? And then they start trying it. And then after a while, we say like, okay, this seems to be something most of the teams are doing. Let's make that a leading practice for us, but it's still open to change, right? So always got to be engaging in these behaviors, but how exactly you do that is up to you. And I think the better you get at these behaviors, the more mature you are as a creative team, as an agile team. And so that's my approach to it. It's not a quantitative measure; it's a qualitative measure. But I think it's proving to be pretty powerful.
Right. Just before we met here online, as there is a lot of music in my life, not only on my T-shirt, I listened to Bob Dylan. He was singing like about that rock atom. Times they are changing. So then I look at your book and I felt like I found out it's been a few years since you wrote that.
Yeah.
Escape velocity, better metrics for agile teams. So my take on this was, well, maybe ask him, what would you do differently this time around?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great question. Short story, right? So, Escape Velocity was written by accident. What happened was I was trying to write a different book, and I ran into writer's block. And I talked to a few different people, and a really good friend and mentor of mine is Johanna Rothman. And Johanna, if you know who she is, has written a number of really good books in the space. And I was talking with her, and she said, "Look, just start writing. Just write every day. Don't worry about what it is, and that should help get you unblocked." And that's what I did. And what I discovered was that about 2 weeks in, I was still writing about metrics. And so I then decided this must be the book I'm supposed to be writing right now. And I went ahead and did it. But I didn't actually have intention in the first place. Looking back on the book now, so a couple things that I would definitely do is I think I would have spent less time on sort of the anti-patterns and some of the kind of warnings and maybe that are in there. The book kind of opens with a lot of like, hey, be careful. And I think that's important, but not as important as the space it took up in the book. I would spend more time on ways to identify and choose metrics. Like, how do you as an organization identify the right metrics for you, and how do you choose them? A little bit of talk about noise to signal ratio. I think one of the challenges I see in a lot of organizations is once they start to adopt metrics, they start radiating hundreds of them. And the problem there is that all of those metrics turn into noise. You don't know what you should be paying attention to or not be paying attention to, right? And you're not getting enough real signal. It's not guiding you. And then I think a huge gap in the book is around kind of the business aspect of things, right? What are your key performance indicators? Are you using objectives and key results, and how do you measure against those and towards those, and more about business metrics? So it's interesting because it's supposed to, it was intended to be a book for technical teams, but the reality of it is, as I really look at it, we're all actually business teams, and we're trying to improve business through the use of software. And so we need to be better connected to that. So those are some of the changes that I would definitely make to the book if I ever do a second edition. Yeah.
Do you do a second part maybe? What is next for you?
So, next for me, like right now, I mean, obviously, I'm pretty busy doing what I'm doing with Covered, and I'm really enjoying that. And we're staffing up and thinking about problems we need to solve, and how do we, we're a relatively, early stage startup. We've got good product market fit. There's a lot to do. But I've talked a bit about the behaviors in this dialogue, and that's what I'm working on right now. Is actually I'm writing a book about the behaviors, and how to apply those in really any creative environment. But again, I'm going to have a focus on software product development. So that's the big thing for me is getting that done. And that's an interesting effort. The kind of the way that I do it is I write way too much and then figure out how to, pare it down. So right now I'm in the write way too much mode.
Right, got it. Thank you very much, Doc. It was really good to have you here. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, experiences. It was really inspiring. I really enjoyed that. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it. It was a good time.
Okay, we got it.
All right.